Hey everyone, Alison Bradley here, and come with me as I explore the beautiful country of Morocco.
My Morocco adventure began with us driving from Casablanca to Marrakech, where we were spending our first night. We arrived at our riad and were greeted with mint tea before heading out to the Medina to wander around and explore on our own before finding somewhere for dinner. This is the main square in Marrakech, and this is where you'll see the snake charmers and monkeys on display. We also walked around the Koutoubia Mosque, also before calling it a night. We woke up to a fantastic and fresh breakfast spread at our riad before heading out on our first tour of the trip, a city tour of Marrakech. We started at one of the entry gates into the walled city before heading out into the Jewish quarter. The first main stop was the Bahia Palace, which is a mid to late 19th century palace that the king at the time built for one of his wives, Bahia, which means brilliant and beautiful. Everything was handmade with natural pigments and every color has meaning. It's truly incredible to see all of these designs and how they're still intact today. After the palace, we headed back through the souks and ended up at an herbalist where I learned how they make argan oil, which I didn't even know came from Morocco. Then we went to the Ben Yusuf Madrasa. Madrasa means school, so this is where they used to teach the Quran. And again, the designs and architecture was just really magnificent. Then it was time to visit YSL's Jardin Majorel. I couldn't get us tickets into the museum, but seeing the garden was still worth it. I visited the garden at the end of the day, so thankfully it wasn't too crowded. It was a huge garden and there was such a variety of plants and flowers to walk around. I always say when you see lily pads, there are never frogs, and well, at the Jardin Majorel, they finally proved me wrong. There were so many frogs and I loved finding them. So after a lovely frolic through the Jardin, we headed back to the Medina where they were having a concert of their typical music in the square, and then we had dinner before heading back to our riad to enjoy the sunset after our first full day in Marrakech. The next morning, we left the Medina of Marrakech and drove through the Atlas Mountains, watching the landscape change as we headed closer and closer to Ouarzazate. We stopped by the Kasbah of Ait Ben Haddou to admire from a distance to see where they filmed the Gladiator movie, then stopped at the Atlas Movie Studios and saw their sets from a distance. We really didn't feel the need to do a tour here since working on a set is part of how I make a living. The next tour we did was at Kasbah Amradil, and this was really interesting to learn about who lived here and how they built this fort all by hand and what life was like living here. The Festival of Roses had just ended by the time I arrived in May, but there was still a few roses left as we passed through the Valley of Roses. And this was on our way to our riad for the evening, where I got to have my first Hammam experience. On this day, we took in the views of the Dades Valley, drove through Tangier on our way to the Gorge of Toubkal, also known as the Grand Canyon of Morocco, where there were plenty of friends there to greet us. Then we continued our drive towards the desert, with first stopping to experience what it's like to dress in traditional Berber clothing. Next, we stopped to learn about how the water system works in the desert and to see the land of fossils in our food. And we knew we were getting close to the desert when we were stopped by a camel crossing. We got wrapped up to protect ourselves by the wind and sand, and then we headed out for our 45-minute camel ride in the Sahara Desert on the way to our luxury camp for the evening. The views were just incredible, and 45 minutes was definitely enough time to be on a camel. At the end of the ride, we arrived at our camp, which was absolutely beautiful, and we spent the evening frolicking on the dunes, learning and trying to sandboard, and enjoying this absolutely beautiful sunset in the Sahara Desert. And we had dinner and hung out under the stars. Started the day by watching the sunrise in the Sahara Desert, had breakfast and coffee with a view before heading out for the day, where we stopped in a little desert village that was once a slave town to hear their music and learn about the history that lies here. We visited the Hassila Bied Gardens. It's a little oasis in the middle of the desert that's used by many local Berber families. Then we checked into our riad in Merzouga, where we had a great pool to lounge in before heading out on our sunset ATV ride. Now, this ATV ride was not a part of our tour, but it was so worth it. I really enjoyed doing this more than even the camel ride that we did the day before. It wasn't even just about the thrill of going fast and up and down the dunes. Like, the adrenaline was there, but that wasn't the point. It was just this unbelievable realization that I was in the Sahara Desert driving myself up and down these sand dunes. It's just unreal. Truly a once-in-a-lifetime experience that I will just never get over. This was my magic carpet ride in the the desert. It was super windy as we did have a sandstorm later this night, so the sunset wasn't the best, but that did not keep us from enjoying this entire experience. Doing some sandboarding again as well, and then my guide was having way too good of a time messing around with me and having me on 2 wheels when I had no idea what was going on, but it was all in good fun and a great second night in the desert. And today we unfortunately had to leave the desert, which at this point was definitely a highlight of the trip, and we are starting our drive towards Fez, where we drove through what is called Monkey Mountain, and I was fine watching them from the car. I didn't have to get out to feed them. And then eventually we arrived in Fez, where we checked into our riad that had an amazing view of the city. We went out for dinner, where we had an even nicer view of the Medina gates.
Today I'm exploring the ancient city of Fez,
where I learned about their 9,000 alleyways, 300 mosques that are in the Medina, 300 neighborhoods, and 4 gates that surround the city. This is just a small part of why Fez has the largest Medina in all of Morocco. Part of the tour was getting to see a tannery where they create leather, and this was just wild to see. You would never know that this exists behind the main buildings in the Medina, and they do everything here by hand. Barely any machines are used. The odor was interesting, which is why they hand you mint leaves to use to block out the odor. We toured the Museum of Arts and Woodworking, another interesting building to go through. Every mosque we saw was just so exquisite, even from just the outside, because only Muslims can go into the mosque. And this one in particular, I was able to see from a nearby store's rooftop. And you can see how it's all green to symbolize the religious power of the mosque. I liked how here in Fez, you were able to see a lot of the craftsmen actually working on their crafts right there in front of their shops. I walked through the most narrow street in all of Fez before we drove to the Royal Palace of Fez to see the front gate. Then we went to 2 different military forts to get even more gorgeous views of the whole city of Fez, before heading to a ceramic factory where we saw how every tile, every pot, every dish is all put together by hand, no machines, and just the amount of detail and hard work that these people put in, it was just truly incredible to see. And then before I knew it, the day was over and my first full day in Fez was complete. We leave the city of Fez and the plan for today is to get to Chefchaouen, but we have a stop along the way, which is the ancient ruins of Volibus. Volibus was a Berber Roman city back in the 3rd century. It was really interesting walking around these ruins and seeing how the mosaic tile is still intact after all this time. The one thing I would have done differently is I wish I would have hired one of their guides to take us around and explain to us in more detail what we were seeing, because it was truly interesting and very unique to see, and it would have been nice to have heard more about the ruins than what we were just reading on the brochure. So do better than I did and book the guide and then fill me in on what I missed out on. Then we finally arrived in Chefchaouen, also known as the Blue City, where we had a great view from our hotel and where we saw the Spanish Mosque, which is important for later. So on this afternoon, we had some free time to roam the city and the very quaint streets, take in the shops and a little bit of history we stumbled across. The main goal was to take the nice long walk up to the Spanish Mosque to watch the sunset. This is definitely the thing to do when in Chefchaouen, but prepare for it to be quite the walk and for there to be crowds of people waiting around for the sun to set. But it is definitely worth waiting around to see the Blue City come to life in the evening. And once the sun set, it was time to find dinner and call it a night. We woke up to have a delicious breakfast on the roof of our riad and roamed the streets of the Blue City a little bit more before we hit the road to head towards the coast. Our first stop was at the Hercules Cave in Tangier, where when we got down into the cave and you look out into the sea, the opening looks like the shape of Africa. Can you see it? This cave dates back to the 1900s and was used by the Berber people for centuries, and was just very interesting to walk around inside the cave and then outside as well, and just to take in these gorgeous views of the sea. From there, we drove a little further up the coast to see where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Mediterranean Sea, and we just walked around and enjoyed the views. Eventually, we made our way into the city of Tangier and walked through their Medina, then had dinner and watched a beautiful sunset by the beach where we could actually see Spain in the distance. It's officially our last full day in Morocco, and we started it with breakfast along the coast before we started our drive towards the capital city of Morocco, Rabat. The first sign that we arrived in Rabat was seeing the Mohammed VI Tower. Then we arrived at the mausoleum of Mohammed V. This is where the tombs of the Moroccan king Mohammed V and his two sons, late King Hassan II and Prince Abdallah, are. The architecture on the outside and the inside of this building were just absolutely incredible. Everywhere you looked, there was something new to discover and admire. Then on the other side of this space is where the Hassan Tower is. This Hassan Tower was never finished after the Sultan passed away in 1199, and it would have been the biggest religious monument in the world in the 12th century. This entire space really was just magnificent to walk around. After we did all that walking, we then went to Cella, which is a medieval and ancient Muslim archaeological site. I enjoyed exploring the Roman ruins of Volibus better than Cella, and this is because it just seemed like Cella was more of a tourist attraction, and when we saw the ruins in Volibus, you really felt like you were walking through the ruins in ancient lands. But either which way, they were both very interesting to see, and we could have gotten a guide to take us around here as well, but we were on a bit of a time crunch, so we just walked around the main sites ourselves that were recommended for us to see, and then we headed on out. We had one more stop in Rabat, which was at this Kasbah, to get one last view of the coast, and then we were on our way to our last stop of the trip in Casablanca, where we were racing the clock to see if we could get into the Grand Mosque for their last tour of the day, which unfortunately we missed, but we still were able to admire it from the outside. So we drove along the coast for a bit until we arrived at our hotel for the night, which was the Sofitel, and we had an incredible view of the Grand Mosque from our room, but an even better one from the rooftop, and we got there just in time to admire this gorgeous sunset. Due to our flight leaving Casablanca, we still had the first half of our day available to us. So we walked the 30 minutes to the Grand Mosque from our hotel so we would be there in time for their first tour of the day. Now I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about visiting the Grand Mosque. Tours happen throughout the day in multiple languages between the calls to prayer. So you need to plan accordingly and pay attention to the time. So when I took the first tour of the day, it was at 9 a.m. There is a museum that you can walk through on your own before the official tour starts. Your knees and shoulders need to be covered. You don't need to cover your head. I did it as a sign of respect, the same way you remove your hat in a church or men wear yarmulkes in temples. You will have to remove your shoes when you enter the mosque, and they give you a bag to hold your shoes in. So I'd recommend wearing socks and sneakers the day you visit. Now for the fun stuff. This Hassan II mosque, which was the idea of the King Hassan II, it was designed by a French architect and is the third largest mosque in the entire world. All materials for the construction are from Morocco, except for the chandeliers. It took 6 years to create, with people working around the clock to complete it. In the Royal Hall, where the majority of the tour takes place, you can see an upstairs, which is where the women usually pray. There is no air conditioning, but the floor is heated, and the roof can slide open within 3 minutes, and it's usually open during Ramadan. The niche faces east for Mecca in Morocco. The last stop of the tour is downstairs, which is the absolution room. You only get to see the men's area, as the women's is separate. This is a magnificent place to visit and must be on your list when visiting Casablanca, and it was a perfect way for me to end my 10-day trip in Morocco.
I hope you enjoyed exploring Morocco with me. For more information about all the things I did on this 10-day trip, check out the links below. So until next time, I'm Allison Berger, and don't forget, FunSized.